When I was looking into just one thing, I'd been sort of aware of it because my sister teaches mindfulness, and kind of breathing is part of that, at least being aware of your breath, but not actually consciously controlling it. And then I came across this really interesting research showing that deep belly breathing. So the idea is it's not just deep breathing or slow breathing. It is belly breathing. You put your hand on your gut, and you should feel it kind of go up and down rather than breathing. You do really slow, deep breaths. And one technique is called 4-2-4. There are quite a few other ones, but essentially you breathe in through your nose to a count of 4, hold it for 2, and then you breathe out through your mouth to a count of 4. And when you do that for even a minute or so, what happens is your heart rate will start to drop and you'll kind of begin to feel calmer. And I was interviewing an expert, and he said one of the reasons is, as Tim was sort of alluding to, you're altering the carbon dioxide levels in your brain. This switches on part of your system known as the parasympathetic system, which is releasing noradrenaline, so everything kind of calms down. And all the great religions have sort of advocated some form of breathing exercise. It's been particularly popular, with people who are doing yoga and things like that. They've always advocated different forms of deep breathing. But now we're kind of recognizing there's something really to it. And when we did a podcast on it, it was overwhelmingly the most popular podcast we had ever done. And that was just about breathing, which shows you, I guess, there are a lot of people out there who experience anxiety and sleeplessness, because I was essentially saying this is a really good way of coping with an anxiety attack, or if you're feeling anxious. But also it's something I do at 3 a.m. when I'm waking, and lots of restless thoughts. I just practice this breathing, and it's surprisingly powerful.
It's really interesting. I was actually, because I read it, I thought that I remember that I was taught breathing techniques in my early 20s. I was diagnosed with a lot of food intolerances, as quite a few people listening to this podcast know, which sort of started my 25-year journey of Zoe. And when I went to see all the doctors, you don't have cancer, etc. That's good. They didn't even know what the microbiome was back then, Michael. So that definitely didn't come into the conversation. And so the conclusion was probably you're really anxious, and this is like a big part of this. And so I got sent to see somebody who taught me about breathing with some sort of feedback mechanism where you could sort of see something on the screen going up and down. And I think what I took away was you really could reduce your level of tension from breathing, and that I was terrible at ever remembering to do it at any points when I really needed to use it. So I think like many of these things, there's this sort of huge gap between like this healthy habit that you should do and then actually managing to do it. Is that a common challenge, or is this just, am I the only person?
Oh, absolutely. But the thing is, you need to practice. You need to practice so that when you are having an anxiety attack, a panic attack, when you're feeling terrible, you actually do it, because your natural inclination is to hyperventilate. That when you're feeling anxious, you're feeling, and then you go, and then that makes you feel much, much worse. And you forget everything you've ever heard on some podcast or other, and you just go,
and that is having the reverse effect, is it? So that it's the opposite of the deep breathing that you're describing. That's actually making you more anxious through this breathing.
Yeah, you've got to kind of practice it. And as I said, you've got to find a technique that works for you. Another very simple one is 4-6. So you breathe in for a count of 4 and then out to a count of 6. And actually the exhale, some people say the exhale should be longer than the inhale. But you find something you're comfortable with, you practice it, you take a few minutes out of the day to do it. You've got to find a trigger. So I find, for example, with things like doing press-ups and squats, I do them first thing in the morning. I do them with my wife, Claire. 2 reasons. One is we encourage each other to do these exercises. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't, because the moment passes. And the other is I'm using the fact I've got to get out of bed as my trigger to do them.
Well, if you want to try and breathe like Michael, you can go on the Zoe Health Study app. And at the moment, we're running a study where we're trying to encourage people to do these habits. And one of them was learning to breathe better, and through just a 5-minute exercise a day. I think, as you said, there are many different ways of doing this, Michael, aren't there? So, but I think the one we had was 3, 4, 5. So breathe in for 3, hold it for 4, then breathe out for 5, which is this idea that actually you slightly, exhaling more and making yourself slightly hypoxic as a way of clearing out the system.
And hypoxic, Tim? Hypoxic means?
Hypoxic means you're getting low in oxygen relatively. So we always thought that was a bad thing. But as Michael says, there are hardly lots of treatments that seem to improve you by doing it. Again, it's this sort of stress. And studies have shown that if you do sort of get rid of oxygen, which means you're by definition building up carbon dioxide in your body more than you would normally do, this can have actual positive benefits and allows you. There's some evidence in athletes that if you build up CO2, then it allows you to use the oxygen better, and actually it's become your body becomes slightly more efficient. So this is all done on small numbers, and we haven't really sort of worked out how this works at a population level. That's why we sort of want more people to do these studies and say, well, who does it work for? Is it same for men and women? Is it different at different ages? And this is something. But the app that we've developed and just still developing, it's still an evolving thing, helps people log every day how they feel and whether it's helping them or not. And I think we'll hopefully come back and we can discuss some of these results. But anyone who wants to go, they can still go on and download that app and have a go. And so it's just another thing to think about in our busy lives. Just think, am I actually breathing properly? Should I? Unless I've got a cold, why am I breathing through my mouth? Think about it.
Absolutely. Interestingly, I've actually just been doing a podcast where we're looking at mouth breathers. And as you say, if you breathe through your mouth, it kind of dries out your mouth. It makes you more prone to infections in the mouth, dental caries and things like that. And obviously you kind of snore more. But what was really interesting is I was talking to a Norwegian scientist, and he said when you breathe through your nose, he discovered that breathing your nose releases nitric oxide in the nose, and this kills the bugs in the nose, but the nitric oxide also travels through your blood to your lungs, and that increases oxygenation, particularly in the upper lobes of the lung. So we don't entirely know what that means, but it's kind of interesting that there is a significant difference between being a mouth breather and a nose breather from that point of view. And again, it's something that the yogics have been keen on for a while. Is yogic a word? I don't know. But yeah, it makes you kind of think even a simple thing like breathing can have quite a profound effect on your sort of mental and physical state.
My grandfather in Australia, when I was 6, took me out every night into the garden. He was in the Australian Army and used to get me and my brother to do deep breathing exercises. We were in our pajamas before going to bed, and we thought he was completely mad. But of course, he was way ahead of his time then.
That's brilliant. Well, I think going into the garden is a brilliant transition to the next simple thing, and I would love to talk about houseplants and the benefits of gardening more widely. I'm quite a keen gardener myself, although I do find that Zoe has slightly restricted the amount of gardening that I might want to do, never mind having broken two toes. But I've never really thought that it had any real health benefits, but I believe, Michael, that there might be some suggestion that it does.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I and Tim and you and everybody would agree that spending time in green spaces is really good for you. And there's also research showing that spending time in blue spaces, which is down by the sea or by a river, is also kind of good for you. We were looking specifically at houseplants. Now, I was kind of critical, or at least a little bit cynical about this. But a couple of years ago, when I was making a series called Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, we did this experiment with the University of Lancaster, which I thought will never work. But the results were really interesting. What we did is we were looking at the health of people living near a busy road, and we got them to wear them pollution monitors, and they had quite high levels of some of the nastier pollutants like the small particle stuff. And when we sort of examined their house, indeed, lots of these small particles were in the house. And so what the scientists said is we are in front of some of the houses, we're going to just put some plants, basically some small trees, silver birch in tubs, and see what happens. And I thought a few silver birch trees are going to make no difference whatsoever. But surprisingly enough, yes, the houses in where the silver birches were in front, the levels of pollution in the houses was lower. And that seemed to be because the silver birches were capturing the pollution in the leaves. And then when it rained, they were sort of flushed off and they went down the sewer. So we thought houseplants. Now, NASA had done an experiment in the late 80s where they had, in an enclosed space, they had increased levels of what are called volatile organic chemicals. These are things like, when you have air freshener, these things, they produce some quite nasty stuff like benzene, which is not terribly good for you, indoor pollution. So what they've done is they've sprayed some of this stuff around, put some houseplants in an enclosed space, and indeed the houseplants had reduced levels of benzene and also, basically hydrated the chamber more. But people said, well, that's an enclosed space, so, what can you expect? But there was another group in Australia who did it in open offices. And again, the introduction of houseplants had quite a big impact on these volatile organic compounds. So, and plus, people kind of liked having them around. And indeed, what they demonstrated is when you take the plants away, people really miss them. And yeah, plants really, you need quite a few. Ideally in a sort of small office. I don't know how big your office is, but if you had 5 or 6 of them in there, that could actually make a difference, both to the quality of the air you're breathing, how hydrated it is, possibly, but not very much carbon dioxide. But again, which I, never underestimate it, the power of the placebo, that you just kind of like having a living thing there. And as long as you look after it, you'll feel a sort of a love for this plant as well.
There are quite a few epidemiology studies about depression and that being lower or protected by people who live in the country rather than urban areas and having gardening as a hobby. So actually gardening as a hobby has come out of a number of surveys as being protective for your mental health. And what's also interesting is we looked in the twins and obviously we found that gut health was generally on average better in people in rural areas than people in cities. So this is things like gut diversity and generally having more species and assuming a better immune function. And we also and that was also associated with lower depression levels. So it could be that people are out, but it's not, rather than just the plants themselves, is actually people touching nature, getting those microbes from the soil and having a better exposure to the general healthy microbiome around us that is healthy. And that's one reason. I mean, some cultures actually have school trips, like Japan, to go and hug trees and go into the forests as a regular part of their activities, whereas, in England it would just be in a concrete playground. But they really appreciate the concept of walking in nature as a regular event for their health.
I love this idea. I normally have a great big plant right behind me, but since it's the winter in the northern hemisphere at the moment, I have it moved over right by the window because it's pretty miserable at this point where the sun is just starting to come back up. So I can sort of shift it back into the darker end of the room.
Absolutely. And you can also grow herbs. I and Tim, I'm sure, very enthusiastic about herbs. Rosemary is a brilliant herb to grow and smells fantastic. You can grow indoors, outdoors. It can be part of your 5 a day, 10 a day, increasing the sort of, the plant. Herbs and spices, particularly herbs, are sort of ignored as part of that thing. But, I love adding all sorts of strange and wonderful herbs to the food I eat. Varies it, but it is a contributor to your kind of gut health.
Wonderful. Well, we've added the house plants to our life now. I feel that was fun and easy. Now let's talk about something that everyone knows they should do, but most people are not quite so excited about. Let's talk about exercise. And I think this idea we started with actually, which is whether or not you might enjoy it, was interesting, but also the sort of exercise that might make sense. And, Michael, I think this is something you've sort of explored a lot through your career. What's your one thing on exercise?
That it's a brilliant thing to do, that you need to do varied. Essentially, there are 3 types of exercise you need to prioritize. There is aerobic exercise, running, walking, swimming, cycling. Then there is resistance exercise, which a lot of people forget about or don't want to do, which is press-up squats, lifting weights. And the third one is balance, because balance is an incredibly important part of, being healthy and growing old, and it falls off pretty fast. So you need to do all three, but some people are more enthusiastic about it than others. So I'm actually okay about doing the press-ups and squats, but I am not so crazy about the running. And indeed, I took part in an experiment a while ago where I got together with some enthusiastic runners. And this was at the University of Nottingham in England. And we were actually measuring something called endocannabinoids. Have you come across them before?
That sounds very complicated.
They're essentially a cannabis-like substance, and they are produced by your body in response to a variety of things, including singing, which we touched on briefly, but also exercise. The thing is that some people get a big hit of them and some of us don't. So in this case, what happened is they took some blood samples before we went for a run. I was with, as I said, enthusiastic runners, came back, measured our endocannabinoid levels. Mine had not shifted an iota. If anything, they'd probably gone down. Whereas the other three, they had shot up. They had such a good time. And one of them, interestingly, suffers from quite serious depression. And you could see the lift in her mood. And then over the course of about 6 hours, as the endocannabinoid levels dropped, you could also see that she was becoming, more withdrawn. And she now runs ultra marathons as her way of self-medicating.
Yeah, well, about 10 years ago, we did do a twin study, several thousand twins, and asked them about exercise participation, and found that there was a clear genetic basis, not only on sort of, how regularly they went to the gym or how regularly that they went for a run or walks. That was quite clear. So that would support the idea that everyone has slightly different thresholds, if you like, that's genetically hardwired. That means that they, doesn't mean they can't exercise, but their preference would tend to be similar in the identical twins compared to the non-identical twins. So it suggests there is some genetic threshold. But clearly, if you have to run, you'll run. If there's a saber-toothed tiger, about to maul you, you'll run. But I think getting that pleasure from it, it could be that some people get more pleasure from lifting weights, as you said. Others get it from running. Others will get it from other forms of stress or relaxation. And in a way, that gives our tribe this sort of diversity and greater survival. So we're not all like lemmings. I mean, as soon as anything happens, we all go off and run a marathon. That would be a bit
burn
weird,
off all those calories, yes, and starve to death a week later.
Yeah. But they think our ancestors generally were doing brisk walking rather than running. And certainly when I was with the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, who are hunter-gatherers, they just walked at an incredibly fast pace, which I couldn't keep up with. And they could do that for very long periods of time.
And I've often heard it described as getting endorphins from exercise. Is this just sort of like people not really understanding the science? And is your cannabis-related substance that I can't pronounce, is that the same thing, or is that something completely different?
It's the same in the sense that it's a naturally produced euphoric, if you like. But there was a while where everything was endorphins. But as I said, now people are kind of looking at other things as well. So I think endocannabinoids is a sort of a sexy new kid on the block, although it's about 10 years since they discovered it. And indeed, the reason they went looking for it is precisely because they were aware with the endorphins that this mimicked, or at least if you take heroin or morphine, this was just mimicking something that we naturally have. So they thought with cannabis kind of gives you a high, it makes you feel good, it makes you feel euphoric. Presumably there must be something in your body which does the same thing, and that's how they came across endocannabinoid receptors, and then they started researching this thing. So also some suggestion that if you if you respond in that way, you get a big surge. That also gives you the munchies, because I'm not a big cannabis consumer, but I am told that it can induce the munchies. So for some people, when they go for a run, they want to eat a lot afterwards. Other people, not so much so.
I think the idea that it's very personal, that's been measured, I find very reassuring, because I do exercise regularly because I'm convinced about the health benefits. And I've never reached that point that I know lots of my friends who just say, oh, I've got this massive high while I'm in the gym doing it. I always feel really good afterwards. And I'm not sure how much of that is from any chemical benefit or how much of it is just knowing that I've finished, I've done it, and I feel good that I've done this good thing. But I don't get the sort of buzz through the exercise, which I know some people talk about, particularly around things like running and all the rest of it. And I've always it seems really unfair. It seems it would be much easier to do the exercise if you were actually getting pleasure from it. I mean, no one ever complains, oh, eating cake is really hard. I'm not getting any, your body is giving you these great positive pleasure feedback, even though your brain is thinking, this is probably not very good for me. So it's very interesting they've actually been able to measure this and seen that, I guess, the story often of the Zoe podcast, that there's this very personalized differences. And that's starting to be something that you can see really, in the chemistry. It's not just people, pretending that they can't feel it.
Well, it's often in the brain, Jonathan. It's often in they do these functional MRI scans, because we don't know all the chemicals. We're just, Michael's talking about some of the ones that are sort of easy to measure. There's probably many that we can't get to at the moment that we'll know in 20 years' time. But they can measure on an MRI scan, which is like a brain scan where bits of your brain light up when they're highly active. And they've done these studies in runners, non-runners, and it's the pleasure centers basically light up. And that seems to be the way we can measure this. And there's definitely variety in that. And I think one of the big challenges in sort of public health is, how do you get people who say, I really don't like exercise, I've never liked it, I hated it at school, doesn't make me feel good, I just feel bad afterwards. How do you get them to exercise? And I think that's, Michael would agree, that's a challenge.
Absolutely, and they are the majority, unfortunately. The other thing we know is that when you do surveys of people, they say, yeah, of course I do 150 minutes. But when you actually fit them with accelerometers and things like that, you find they're just lying. And the number of people who hit the guidelines is, in some cases, less than 10%. So that is the challenge of our time. How do you make it pleasurable? And you can make it more pleasurable by doing it with a friend. You're more likely to persist with it if you've got a friend running with you, if you've got a friend down the gym. The only reason people really employ personal trainers is because the personal trainer is going to dig them out of bed and make them go for the run. And there is some companionship in that. So it's, how do you manage that? Just telling people that exercise is good for them is not actually going to make them do exercise when the alternative is sitting on the sofa, eating eclairs and watching the TV, which is fun for most people, although in the long term, extremely bad for them. So just exhortation alone ain't going to do it. And so I'm a kind of great believer, you kind of got to build it into your life. I live at the top of a steep hill, and so I always cycle to the station. It's just over a mile. And I say to my wife, under no circumstances pick me up. Even if I ring you up and ask you to come and collect me, say no. But that will force me to go up the hill, and then I put in little bursts of HIIT while I'm going up and arrive sweaty and hugely resentful, but at least I've done it.